Every major religion asks you to follow a teacher. Christianity asks you to believe that a publicly executed man, pronounced dead by Roman authorities, stood up again, walked out of his grave, and appeared to people who knew him well. Not symbolically, not spiritually, not metaphorically, but physically. And that single claim sits at the center of Christianity like a load-bearing wall. I mean, remove it, and the entire structure of Christianity collapses. The Apostle Paul understood this better than anyone when writing to the church in Corinth. He said plainly,
"If Christ has not been raised, then Christian faith is useless, preaching is pointless, and believers are still trapped in their sins."
See, Christianity is not built on vague spiritual optimism. It's built on a historical assertion that can, in principle, be investigated, challenged, and either accepted or rejected. So in this episode, we're not asking whether the resurrection is comforting. We're not even asking whether it feels meaningful. We're asking whether it actually happened. Did Jesus of Nazareth really rise from the dead? My name is Ken Koger. Join me as we explore age-old questions and the compelling answers behind why Christians believe. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, we dig into the archaeology, history, and the evidence to offer rational, reasoned answers for the Christian faith. This is Apollos Answers. So before we look at evidence, we need to talk about method. How do historians evaluate claims about the past, especially extraordinary ones? Historians don't have the luxury of time machines. They work with sources, context, corroboration, and explanatory power. And they ask questions like, how early is the testimony? Is it independent? Is it embarrassing to the author? Does it align with what we already know about archaeology and culture? And most importantly, what explanation best accounts for all the available data? These are the same tools historians use to study Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or the fall of Rome. The resurrection of Jesus isn't excluded from historical investigation, not even because it's miraculous. It's investigated just like any other event, and then conclusions are drawn. Let's begin with one of the most foundational facts. Jesus of Nazareth died by Roman crucifixion. This is one of the most secure facts in ancient history. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century, tells us that Jesus was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. The Jewish historian Josephus refers to Jesus being condemned and crucified. And Lucian of Samosata mocks Christians for worshiping a crucified man. Even hostile Jewish sources in the Talmud acknowledge that Jesus was executed. Crucifixion wasn't a symbolic punishment. It was brutal, public, carefully supervised, and designed to ensure death. Roman soldiers were professionals, and failure to carry out an execution could cost them their own lives. And even before crucifixion, Jesus was scourged, an act that alone killed many victims. So by the time Jesus was nailed to the cross, he was already severely weakened. John's Gospel records that a Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side, producing a flow of blood and water, an observation that's consistent with death by asphyxiation and cardiac rupture. So whatever one believes about the resurrection, the idea that Jesus merely fainted or survived isn't taken seriously by modern scholarship. Jesus was dead. After Jesus' death, his body didn't disappear into obscurity. All 4 Gospels record that he was buried by a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Now, Joseph was not a disciple. He was a member of the Jewish council known as the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was the highest Jewish governing body in 1st century Judea. It functioned sort of as a religious court, a political authority, and a liaison with Roman power. This was the same council that played a central role in Jesus' condemnation. And that detail matters because early Christians were openly accusing this leadership of actually rejecting God's Messiah. So inventing a Sanhedrin council member as the caretaker of Jesus' body would severely undermine their own argument. And this is what historians call it an embarrassing or a counterproductive detail. In addition to the biblical accounts, early non-Christian sources indirectly support the burial narrative as well. For instance, early Jewish polemics do not deny the burial or the empty tomb. Instead, they attempt to explain the empty tomb by claiming the disciples stole the body. That response only makes sense if there was a known tomb and a known burial location. Jesus was buried in a specific, identifiable place. This matters because burial anchors the resurrection claim in space and time. Christian proclamation didn't begin decades later in a distant land. It began in Jerusalem, the city where Jesus had been publicly executed. Now, within days of the crucifixion, something extraordinary was being proclaimed. The tomb was empty. Now, we're going to devote an entire future episode to the empty tomb itself, but for now, it's important to understand why the tomb matters at all. You see, women were the first witnesses, and in first century Jewish culture, women were not considered reliable legal witnesses. If the early church were inventing a resurrection narrative, the witnesses would have been, say, Peter, John, or another prominent male disciple. Instead, the Gospels unanimously report that women discovering the empty tomb. That's not how myths are written. Additionally, early Jewish explanations actually concede the empty tomb by claiming that the disciples stole the body. So you don't explain away a body that's still there, walking, talking, eating, and interacting with people for 40 days. An empty tomb alone doesn't produce resurrection belief. What changed everything was the claim that Jesus appeared alive to his followers. The earliest summary of this belief is preserved in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul tells the Corinthians that he's passing on what he himself received. Most scholars date this creed to within 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion, some even earlier. And this creed names witnesses: Peter, the 12, James, all the apostles, and at one point more than 500 people all at once. And then Paul adds a remarkable line. See, most of these witnesses, he says, are still alive. In other words, go check with them. Now, before the crucifixion, the disciples are not portrayed as heroes. They misunderstand Jesus, they argue about status, they flee when he's arrested. Peter denies even knowing him. And then after the crucifixion, these same men suddenly begin proclaiming the resurrection publicly in the very city where Jesus was killed. And they do this knowing it'll cost them everything. They don't gain wealth, no political power, no safety. And what they do gain is persecution, imprisonment, and death. People may die for what they believe is true, but nobody willingly dies for what they know is a lie. If the resurrection didn't happen, then something else must account for the data. Serious skepticism deserves serious consideration. So in future episodes, we're actually going to go through in depth each one of these alternative explanations. But for now, we'll just discuss the primary ones. So first theory, hallucinations. Hallucinations are individual subjective experiences. I stress individual. They don't occur to groups of people simultaneously. They don't involve extended conversations or shared meals or repeated appearances over weeks. And hallucinations don't explain why the tomb was empty. Now, the second theory, the disciples stole the body. Now, see, this theory especially struggles with motive and psychology. They didn't gain any power, they didn't gain wealth, no protection by stealing the body. So conspiracies usually will collapse under pressure. Now, the third theory is Jesus was buried in the wrong tomb. Jewish and Roman authorities could have easily corrected this whole wrong tomb theory by just opening up the correct tomb. They had every incentive to correct the mistake, but yet they didn't. Producing the body would have ended Christianity instantly. And then the fourth theory is what's called the swoon theory. For those of you who are not familiar with the swoon theory, it's the conspiracy claim that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, but he merely fainted or fell into some deep coma-like state from torture. Most historians reject this theory primarily due to the severity of Roman execution methods. And again, we'll devote an entire episode just to the swoon theory alone. We'll dive into studies that have been done by medical authorities, but for now, a half-dead man doesn't really inspire worship. So each of these theories explain part of the evidence, but it doesn't explain all of it. I want to touch on James for a moment. See, James was Jesus' half-brother, and he didn't believe Jesus was who he said he was during Jesus' ministry. And then Jesus appeared to him, and all of a sudden, James becomes a leader for the church, and he dies a martyr. So what would it take to convince you that your own brother was the risen Lord? So let's discuss Paul. Prior to becoming Paul the Apostle, Paul was formerly known as Saul of Tarsus. Now, Saul was a Roman citizen. He was a well-educated Jewish Pharisee, and Saul actively sought to destroy Christians in the early church. I mean, destruction to Saul meant murder, persecution, and, for instance, dragging men and women off to prison, among other things. I mean, he hunted Christian believers. And then all of a sudden, Paul claims to have encountered the risen Jesus, and everything changes. Paul goes from murder and mayhem to becoming one of the hunted. So whatever happened on the road to Damascus wasn't imagined away. So where does that leave us? Historians ask a demanding question. What explanation best accounts for all the data? At this point, we're no longer asking whether the resurrection story exists. We're asking how it fares under historical scrutiny. And many of the strongest confirmations come from critical non-Christian historians. I mean, in the past, we've got Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian, Pliny the Younger. And in modern times, modern scholars, we've got Bart Ehrman, a renowned New Testament scholar and secular agnostic, Gerd Ludemann, academic scholar in New Testament studies and an atheist, E.P. Sanders, an internationally respected New Testament scholar. They all concede the core facts. It was a public execution, a known burial, an empty tomb, eyewitness claims, and transformation. The resurrection isn't accepted because it's comforting. It's considered because something extraordinary happened, and every alternative explanation must account for all of the data. So if it happened, Jesus isn't merely a teacher. Death isn't final, and meaning is not illusion. So did Jesus really rise from the dead? Well, the evidence points to yes. My name is Ken Koger, and this is Apollos Answers.